Now, this tutorial is simply an attempt to take you through the various arguments you have set in your assessment in order to clarify the key points that emerge from them. And while doing so, we'll also introduce a little more technical jargon. Let's begin with the first argument. Jim is a politician. All politicians are liars, therefore Jim is a liar. The first thing to note is that this is clearly a valid deductive argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. The truth of the premises absolutely guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So it couldn't be that Jim is a politician or politicians are liars, but Jim is not a liar. Now note why this is the case though. The form of the argument is A is B, all B's are C, therefore A is C. And the point of giving you this formal, almost algebraic representation of the argument is to stress that the content of the argument is irrelevant to its validity. The reason the argument is valid is that any form of argument that takes this form is valid. And most notably, that means that argument 2, Socrates is a pig, all pigs can fly, therefore Socrates can fly, is a valid argument. It takes the very same form as argument number 1. Now, I imagine that nobody finds this particular argument very convincing. Some of you may have found argument 1 convincing, depending on your degree of faith in politicians these days, but argument 2 isn't convincing. And that's because I imagine everybody knows that premise number 2, all pigs can fly, is false. But the point here is that validity has nothing to do with truth or falsehood. It's about the form of the argument, not its content. Logic in general is like this. It's a wonderful instrument for manipulating ideas and proving things on the basis of premises. But it cannot decide whether or not the premises are true. So, both of our first two arguments are good arguments from the perspective of logic. For both of them, it is the case that if the premises are true, and note we say if, we aren't saying they are, we're just saying if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But these might not be quite such good arguments when it comes to asking whether or not they are actually arguments that give us true conclusions. By the way, a valid deductive argument that does have true premises is called a sound argument. So our classic example, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, is a valid deductive argument that is sound. Let's move on briefly to argument 3. 98% of snails are slimy. There is a snail in my backyard. Therefore, the snail in my backyard is slimy. Now, this is an inductive argument. The truth of the premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It could be that my snail is among the 2% of non-slimy snails. So, it's certainly quite a good inductive argument. Given the probabilities involved, it's pretty likely the snail in my backyard is slimy. The premises certainly support the conclusion, but they can't guarantee it by logic through the form of the argument. We cannot infer the conclusion from the premises via logic. The idea of validity, therefore, isn't really relevant to inductive arguments like this. We might say the argument is reasonable, plausible. The probability that the conclusion is true is pretty high, but we can't really speak of validity here. So, this might be a pretty good argument inductively, but it's not an argument that we would call valid. What of argument number 4? All politicians are liars, all used car salesmen are liars, therefore all politicians are used car salesmen. Now, if we represent the argument formally, as we did before, we have all A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's. And this is clearly not a valid argument form. It's like arguing that all elephants are tall, all basketball players are tall, and therefore all basketball players are elephants. Now compare this to a valid form of argument. All blue whales are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded, therefore all blue whales are warm-blooded. The form of that argument, all A's are B, all B's are C, therefore all A's are C, should be pretty clearly different to the form of the argument you can see on the left-hand side. So here we have an argument clearly that takes an invalid form. What finally of the fifth argument? Grass is green, therefore grass is green. Now on the one hand, it actually seems to be both a valid argument and a sound argument. Think about it. It's impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. If the premise is true, the conclusion must be true. So it's valid. It's also sound because the premise happens to be true. So what's wrong with the argument? Well, logically speaking, not that much, but it's clearly not a persuasive argument, and therefore it's not a good argument from a practical perspective if one wished to persuade someone of the conclusion. We would say this is a circular argument. It argues in a circle. It starts with the conclusion and then tries to prove the conclusion on the basis of the conclusion. So it's therefore unpersuasive. But it is valid and it is sound. Hopefully that's all helped you to consolidate what you've learned this week a little bit. And now we have some idea about the nature of philosophical argument. So we can at last begin Module 2 and start introducing Jewish philosophy.